I think the question to be asked, and it's a question that's usually answered in a very racist kind of a way, is why is it that these regions aren't prosperous like, European countries that are, uh, that have far less resources but are actually prosperous. I think, there's usually a very racist answer to that. And would you like to comment on that?
I don't know. No, I don't know what the racist reference is, but I'll say it in a different way. The further back in time you go in this part of the world, the richer it is in everything.
Yeah.
The richer it is in sorry to use this word, but culture. Is a very cosmopolitan part of the world. It once was among the most cosmopolitan. And this is real cosmopolitanism, not the flimsy type that people talk about. It's real. You have diversity of everything, and languages are spoken. Fundamentalists live next to secularists, and Europeans come to this part of the world to work, and add to that a real healthy exchange of communities that don't always see eye to eye, but live side by side, and an intersection that you want. There's a reason for it, and it makes sense geographically and historically. So there's a mosaic that's magnificent, and it's all but gone today. And I think I know where the question's going. There are parts of this region that are very rich, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait, Qatar, or even for that matter, Iran, that have resources, have money to spend, but that's an abnormal wealth of oil and oil money that doesn't exist in other parts of the world. Clearly doesn't exist in Lebanon. All the banks that once operated here, the 90 banks that were once here, their investors are gone. The money and the talent, the education, we had the most impressive university in this part of the world. American University of Beirut ranks lower and lower every year, almost shut down last year. This is a unfortunate flight to oil producing countries. But even then, whether it's the UAE with its very strange setup in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, or whether it's Saudi Arabia, with its vicious form of theocracy, or even for that matter, Iran, which spends almost all of its money on regional war, that money is not spent the right way.
Yeah.
So we have wealth, but it chased oil. The real wealth, the real richness of this part of the world is gone. I mean, these cities don't look or feel, or even they're not the same. I mean, Alexandria in Egypt, Beirut in Lebanon. Sorry to include Turkey here, but I'll include it. Smyrna and Izmir. These places are not what they used to be, and that's a 20th century story. Except Beirut somehow, even after civil war, even after repeated invasion, Israeli invasion or Syrian invasion and occupation, up until the port blast, even with economic dysfunction, we still prided ourselves as being the last bastion, which is why many people would flock here. And I'm going to include you, Khalid. You didn't have to be here, but you chose to be here. I'm guessing you wanted to come here because there's an enchantment to visiting this city. That's gone. And that's a very sad ending to the city, because it had that. And people use this word repeatedly, resilience. That's what they were talking about. It was a resilient city, but it doesn't feel that way anymore. So I think, unfortunately, Lebanon has joined the club.
Well, to get into a little bit of history, if I may, since you brought up the history so beautifully, and I think it's important for people to know that we have a rich history, and that this is something that we should know and fall back on, to know also what our future may look like as well. In terms of resources, yes, in terms of like what we're calling like hard resources, let's say oil and gas, if we're talking about the Gulf states or Iran, what have you. Sure. But if we go back in time and we look at like, let's say the Levant area, or Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, those areas that were not rich in natural resources, but they were rich in people. Like the people were like, it's the human resources, I think, that made that area shine, in that if you didn't have the wealth of other parts of the world, you had commerce, you had trade, you had the exchange of, as you put it, cultures, the intermixing of cultures, and where all these different civilizations met would produce something beautiful, and it did. And so, unfortunately, with war, as we see now, and we've seen in the past, people flee, and that creates a brain drain in those areas, and it's a huge loss. However, if we also look at the history of our region, it's survived a lot of war and a lot of conflict, a lot of invasions, and somehow it comes back at some point. People are able to eventually come together and make something out of what remained. And so, I don't know how long that might take, if that'll be in our lifetimes or not, but we for people who think that this region is just utter devastation and chaos and destruction, and it's always been that way, they should know that that's not the case, right? And that the people have the capacity. I know that when I mean, my family's Syrian. I grew up in Syria, and I heard the same thing about Lebanon as well after the civil war. When you have a conflict like that, you have a lot of people who become expats or refugees who flee, but they have so much desire to come back. And when things settle down, a lot of them do, and they do good things. I mean, you want the right sort of environment, you want the right uh, political system to accommodate that, of course. That comes before anything else. And I think that was where, as you mentioned, there was a big mistake in the post-Civil War period in Lebanon.
I completely agree. And I think Syria is the most striking example, where a population is forced into something that is so miserable, where half the population is displaced or is out of the country, where too many decent people are killed, challenging the worst form of autocracy. And when they are given that chance today to go home, they're going home to something that did the same thing. It's a very difficult decision. Can you return when things have gotten worse and the same crowd is still ruling? I think that is an ultimate red line for the decent people that fled but should come back. Because who would want to? If you're out and those people are still around, you don't want to return. This is what makes our part of the world, I think, strikingly different. I'll give you an example. Hundreds of thousands of Bosnians were forced to flee, whether it's Sarajevo or Mostar or anywhere in Bosnia. Many Croatians, many Serbians too, forced out. They may not be coming back to the version that they dreamed of. It may not be the most decent form of accountability. It may not be the most peaceful situation, but they're returning, and this is 25 years later. They're returning, whether it's in Germany or in America or Australia, to a country that they believe in, and one that is getting better and better. Whether it's through EU accession, whether it's through economic prosperity, or whether it's even through the guarantee that those murderers were held to account, at least up to a point. This could be Ratko Mladic or Karadzic, paramilitary leaders responsible for genocide. Even when their posters are put up now, they're taken down. So there's an assurance that there's no impunity. This word, I think we don't even consider it in this part of the world. Take it as it is. Impunity is part of the story, which it shouldn't be. So there's no paying a price for being a criminal in this part of the world. I think if one day we have that, if these types of criminals are held to account, at least to a point, I think you would see the description that you laid out, which is, why would you want to be in California when you're from one of the most beautiful countries in the world? Why would the other Khalid want to be in, is it Los Angeles where you guys are?
Yeah.
I'm guessing. Okay, I mean, Los Angeles, fine. Traffic, yeah, it's terrible in Cairo too, but Cairo, not too long ago, would trounce Los Angeles. And that's not the case right now.
I mean,
yeah,
we hands down.
1980s, like, you know what I mean? Like
exactly.
The 80s and 90s trashed Cairo, and part of it was neoliberal reforms to the economy that brought in like foreign investors that basically just enriched a small amount of the population and kind of trash. There's a lot of stuff to talk, you know, in terms of like like how populations, you know.
But it's so bad, Khalid. It's so bad that your reference point is the 1980s, which are the good days, which are still pretty bad compared to the shining star Cairo once was.
Yeah, in the 1960s, you know.
Yeah. But this is something that I think it makes no sense why those that love this part of the world the most are not here. But if you put the word impunity in there, well, meaning there's no accountability, you'd want to be in a sorry.
Well, I mean, like, it's very interesting that you brought up Serbia and the Bosnian conflict, because the Serbian military leaders are some of the only people that have actually been convicted in the international court ever. You know, like no one, you know, the international law doesn't, like, it's never, it's very hard to prosecute. And Serbians are some of the only people where they actually successfully prosecuted some of these people.
I think that was like an example of, like, you know, let's give some sort of legitimacy to this court. So let's just go after the Serbians. But yeah, no, I agree with
the
what you're saying.